There is a version of World War II that most people know. It has a shape to it, a beginning and an end, heroes and villains arranged in a way that makes the whole thing comprehensible, even necessary. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The war that actually happened was not a story about good defeating evil. It was a story about systems, about processes, about the extraordinary human capacity to make catastrophic things feel procedurally normal. The most disturbing truth about World War II is not what was done in darkness. It is what was done in daylight, with paperwork, with signatures, with budgets and schedules and lunch breaks. It is that the machinery of mass death was also in many ways a model of institutional efficiency. And efficiency does not carry moral weight. It simply carries outcomes. What was censored after the war was not always dramatic. Some of it was mundane to the point of being almost unbearable. Records were sealed not because they revealed monsters, but because they revealed something harder to process. Ordinary people doing extraordinary damage within the boundaries of their job descriptions. The 22 truths that follow are not spectacular. They are quiet. They are administrative. They are the kind of facts that, once understood, do not leave. The first of these truths concerns the Allied bombing campaign against German civilians. The official history frames the strategic bombing of Germany as a military necessity, a campaign designed to break industrial capacity and shorten the war. What was downplayed, then and for decades afterward, was the degree to which British and American planners knew that the primary effect of certain bombing runs would not be on factories or railroads, but on civilian populations. The Firestorm campaign, culminating in the bombing of Dresden in February 1945, was not a miscalculation. It was a policy. Arthur Harris, the head of RAF Bomber Command, referred in internal correspondence to the deliberate targeting of working-class residential areas because destroying worker housing would, in theory, reduce industrial output more efficiently than bombing the factories themselves. This logic was documented. It was signed off on. It was allocated a budget. The planes that flew over German cities were following orders that had been approved at the highest levels of Allied military command, and those orders specified that the people living in those cities were, in functional terms, legitimate targets because of where they worked and what those factories produced. After the war, this was not classified because it revealed something illegal under the laws that existed at the time. It was quietly archived because it complicated the moral narrative that the Allies had constructed around themselves. Harris was never given a campaign medal. A statue proposed in his honor was controversial for decades. But the orders he followed and the orders he gave were never prosecuted, never formally condemned, and the men who flew those missions were honored as heroes, which many of them were, while the policy that put them in those planes was folded into the category of historical complexity and largely left there. The second truth concerns how the German bureaucracy managed the logistics of mass murder not as a secret conspiracy conducted by fanatics, but as a normal function of government administration. Hannah Arendt's observation about the banality of evil has become famous, but what has been less thoroughly absorbed is how literally true it was at the operational level. The transportation of Jewish populations across occupied Europe was coordinated by the Reich Railway, the Reichsbahn, using standard ticketing protocols. Deportees were charged third-class fare. Group discount rates applied. The accounting departments of the railway processed these transactions alongside freight shipments and passenger travel. The clerks who processed the paperwork were not, in most cases, ideologically motivated executioners. They were transportation administrators. The system they worked within had been adapted to include human cargo, and within that system, the cargo was processed according to existing procedural norms. This is not a metaphor. The invoices exist. The rate schedules exist. There are documents in German archives that show the per-kilometer pricing for deportation transports, the administrative correspondence about scheduling conflicts when deportation trains needed to share track capacity with regular passenger service, and the bureaucratic negotiation about priority routing. The machinery of extermination was integrated into the machinery of ordinary government function so thoroughly that participation did not require ideological commitment. It required only that a person show up to work and process their assigned tasks. The third truth involves the United States government's deliberate suppression of knowledge about the Holocaust during the war years, a suppression that went beyond simple ignorance. By 1942, the American government had reliable information about the systematic extermination of Jewish populations in Eastern Europe. This information came from multiple sources: diplomatic cables, reports from Jewish organizations with contacts inside occupied territories, intercepts from signals intelligence. The question of why the United States did not act more decisively, did not bomb rail lines leading to extermination camps, did not issue stronger public statements, has been debated extensively. What has been less prominently discussed is the role of institutional anti-Semitism within the State Department itself in shaping the response. Breckinridge Long, the Assistant Secretary of State responsible for refugee affairs, worked actively within the bureaucratic system to reduce the number of Jewish refugees admitted to the United States. He did this not through dramatic policy confrontations, but through the slow, patient manipulation of administrative procedure. He added new documentary requirements for visa applications. He extended processing times. He interpreted existing regulations in ways that maximized rejection rates. He did this while Europe was in the process of systematically murdering millions of people, and he did it from behind a desk, using the tools of normal bureaucratic function. His memos from this period are models of administrative clarity. They are polite, well-organized, and completely lethal in their implications. The Treasury Department eventually forced a confrontation on the issue, and the War Refugee Board was established in 1944, late enough that most of the people it might have saved had already been killed. The internal Treasury report that forced this action was titled, "With Unusual Directness for a Government Document, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews." It was written in 1944. It accused State Department officials of deliberately sabotaging rescue efforts. It was not publicly released until decades later. The fourth truth concerns medical experimentation conducted not only in concentration camps by SS doctors, but within Allied and neutral medical institutions that operated in the shadow of wartime necessity. The most documented example is the American government's deliberate infection of prisoners in the United States with sexually transmitted diseases as part of research conducted in Guatemala. This research, which occurred between 1946 and 1948, was conducted by the same researchers involved in wartime medical studies and was authorized at levels of the American public health establishment that extended well into the mainstream of the medical profession. It was not discovered publicly until 2010. The logic that made it possible was the same logic that the Nuremberg Code, written in response to Nazi medical atrocities, was designed to prevent. The idea that the welfare of research subjects is subordinate to the scientific value of the data being collected. But even within the war itself, British and American research programs subjected soldiers to experimental conditions without full disclosure. Mustard gas experiments conducted on British, American, and colonial troops in the Second World War involved deliberate exposure to chemical agents under conditions that were not consensual in any meaningful sense. Soldiers were told they were participating in tests of protective equipment. Many were not told what the agent was. Follow-up medical care for long-term effects was inadequate. The records of these experiments were classified for decades, and veterans who suffered chronic health consequences as a result were, in many cases, unable to access documentation of what had been done to them because the documentation remained sealed. The fifth truth concerns the Japanese-American internment program, not as a violation that was immediately recognized as such by those who implemented it, but as a policy that was defended, rationalized, and implemented with the full apparatus of American legal and administrative legitimacy. Executive Order 9066 was signed by Roosevelt in February 1942. It was implemented by the Army. It was upheld by the Supreme Court. The people who carried it out were following orders that had been validated by every level of the American governmental system. Property was seized, businesses were lost, families were moved to facilities that were, by any honest assessment, prisons. What is less commonly emphasized is the degree to which economic motivation intertwined with stated security concerns. In California, where the Japanese-American population was largest, there were documented instances of non-Japanese competitors in agricultural industries lobbying for removal. The Los Angeles Times ran editorials that reflected the views of business interests that stood to benefit from the elimination of Japanese-American competition. These economic interests found their arguments validated by military necessity, framing that, as was established conclusively in the decades that followed, was not supported by credible intelligence. The government's own files showed that the FBI, Naval Intelligence, and the Federal Communications Commission had all concluded that Japanese Americans did not represent the security threat that the internment order presupposed. These findings were withheld from the Supreme Court when it considered the constitutionality of internment. This is not a minor administrative irregularity. The government of the United States withheld evidence from its own Supreme Court in order to achieve a legal outcome it preferred. This was documented in the 1980s when the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians reviewed the record and found that the military necessity argument had been based on, in their words, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The Korematsu decision, which upheld internment, remained technically on the books as precedent until it was finally overruled in 2018. The sixth truth involves the systematic looting of Europe by both German forces and subsequently by Allied forces in ways that were formally prohibited by the same laws of war that Allied governments had affirmed. German looting of art, gold, and cultural property is extensively documented and has been the subject of post-war restitution efforts for decades. Less prominently discussed is the scale of looting conducted by American, British, French, and Soviet troops as the war ended and in its immediate aftermath. American soldiers, from enlisted men to officers, took property from German homes, museums, and institutions on a scale that was massive and that was known to military command. In some cases, entire museum collections disappeared. Art objects, jewelry, gold, historical documents, and countless personal possessions were taken as trophies, souvenirs, or opportunistic theft. The Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, the Monuments Men as they have been romanticized in popular culture, was small, understaffed, and arrived in many cases after significant looting had already occurred. The program's own reports describe the frustration of working against an institutional culture in which taking things from Germany was understood by most soldiers as entirely acceptable, even deserved. Commanders who were sympathetic to preservation efforts often found themselves unable to enforce compliance across large numbers of troops who saw no reason why the normal rules of property should apply to a defeated enemy. Soviet looting was conducted on an explicitly industrial scale and with formal state authorization. The trophy brigades were official military units tasked with identifying and removing cultural and industrial property from occupied territory. They operated with inventories and shipping schedules. The artworks and property they removed, including hundreds of thousands of pieces that had themselves been looted from Soviet territory by German forces, are still in Russian state collections. Russian law passed in the 1990s formally declared this property to be Russian state property as compensation for wartime losses, a position that most international legal frameworks do not recognize, but that remains operative. The seventh truth concerns the Pacific War and the deliberate targeting of Japanese civilian populations through firebombing campaigns that, in terms of immediate casualties, may have exceeded the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The March 9th to 10th, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo, Operation Meeting House, killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night. The operation was designed by General Curtis LeMay and involved dropping incendiary bombs on densely populated residential areas. LeMay himself noted afterward that if the United States had lost the war, he would have expected to be tried as a war criminal. This acknowledgement, which LeMay made in his memoir, is unusual in its directness. The campaign he commanded killed more civilians in Japan than any other military operation of the war apart from the atomic bombings, and it did so through a deliberate calculation that the wooden construction of Japanese urban areas made incendiary attack maximally effective, and that the civilian population living in those areas was a legitimate military target because of its relationship to industrial production. The logic was identical to the logic that Arthur Harris applied in Germany. It was systematic, it was documented, it was approved at the highest levels, and it was almost entirely absent from the moral framework that the United States applied to the war in its official narratives. The eighth truth involves the surrender terms offered to Japan and the role that the Soviet declaration of war, which occurred on August 8, 1945, may have played in Japan's decision to surrender relative to the role of the atomic bombs. This is contested historical territory, and it should be approached carefully. But there is a substantial body of scholarship, including work by historians Tsuyoshi Hasegawa and others, that argues the Japanese government's primary shock in the final days of the war was not the atomic bombings, as devastating as they were, but the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, which destroyed the Japanese government's remaining strategy for negotiating a conditional surrender through Soviet mediation. The significance of this is not that the atomic bombs were therefore unnecessary, a question that cannot be resolved because counterfactual history does not permit certainty. The significance is that the American government's post-war narrative about why Japan surrendered shaped decades of policy, public understanding, and moral framework around nuclear weapons in ways that may not accurately reflect what actually ended the war in the Pacific. If the Soviet entry into the war was the decisive factor, or even a factor of equal importance to the atomic bombings, then the strategic calculation that led to the decision to drop the bombs and the moral justifications constructed around that decision deserve more careful examination than they typically receive in American public discourse. The ninth truth concerns the fate of Eastern European populations under Soviet occupation, a subject that was systematically downplayed in Western public discourse during the war, because the Soviet Union was an essential military ally, and remained after the war a necessary partner in managing occupied Germany. The deportations conducted by the Soviet Union in the Baltic states and eastern Poland, beginning in 1940 and continuing after the war's end, moved hundreds of thousands of people to labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia. These deportations were conducted with the same administrative thoroughness that characterized German deportation programs. Lists were compiled, categories were defined, quotas were assigned, trains were scheduled. The people deported were classified as enemies of the state using criteria that were, in practice, almost entirely ethnic and political rather than based on individual conduct. Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Ukrainians, and Poles were removed from their homes based on their nationality, their family connections to anyone who had held positions of authority under pre-Soviet governments, or simply their status as farmers who owned their land. The mortality rates in the camps where they were sent were extremely high, particularly in the early years. The conditions were lethal. They were also routine. The Soviet NKVD ran these camps as an ordinary function of state administration, with budgets and performance metrics and administrative hierarchies that operated exactly like any other Soviet government institution. Churchill and Roosevelt were aware of Soviet deportation practices. The Katyn massacre, in which the Soviet NKVD executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals in the spring of 1940, was known to the British government by 1943. The decision was made to attribute the massacre to Germany rather than acknowledge Soviet responsibility, because maintaining the alliance with the Soviet Union was considered strategically essential. British intelligence files on Katyn were classified until 1992. American intelligence files were classified until 2012. The Polish government in exile, which was the legitimate government of Poland recognized by the Allies until 1945, insisted throughout the war that Soviets had committed the massacre. They were correct. They were also politically inconvenient, and they were treated accordingly. The 10th truth involves the Japanese Unit 731 and the decision by the American government to grant immunity from prosecution to the scientists and officers who had conducted biological warfare experiments on prisoners in exchange for the research data those experiments had produced. This decision was made in 1947 and remained classified for decades. The experiments conducted by Unit 731 involved deliberate infection of prisoners with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and other pathogens. They involved vivisection, frostbite experiments in which prisoners' limbs were frozen and then amputated, pressure experiments, and other procedures that killed several thousand people over the course of the unit's operation. The American decision to trade immunity for data was made by officials who concluded that the biological warfare data was valuable enough to justify protecting those who had produced it from the same legal accountability that was being applied at Nuremberg to German war criminals. General Douglas MacArthur approved the arrangement. The research data was used by American biological warfare research programs. The scientists involved returned to civilian life in Japan, many of them to careers in medicine and academia. Some became prominent public figures. None were prosecuted. The Soviet Union tried 12 Unit 731 members in 1949 at the Khabarovsk war crimes trial, a proceeding the United States dismissed as Soviet propaganda, in part because American acknowledgement of the trial's legitimacy would have complicated the immunity deal. The 11th truth concerns the expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe at the end of the war, an event that displaced between 12 and 14 million people, and in which somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people died, primarily from violence, exposure, and disease. This expulsion was authorized by the Potsdam Agreement of 1945, which included a clause calling for the transfer of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary to be carried out in an orderly and humane manner. It was not conducted in an orderly and humane manner. The expulsions began before Potsdam formally authorized them, in the form of what historians call the wild expulsions, in which German civilians were driven from their homes by Czech and Polish authorities and irregular forces with a level of violence that included killings, beatings, sexual assault, and forced labor. The Potsdam Agreement retroactively legitimized a process that was already underway and that had already produced substantial civilian casualties. The organized expulsions that followed were less violent, but still resulted in enormous suffering and significant mortality from the conditions of travel and the inadequacy of reception arrangements in occupied Germany. This event was largely absent from Western public discourse for decades. In Germany, it was a politically sensitive subject because discussing German victimhood in the context of the war that Germany had started and the atrocities Germany had committed was fraught with the risk of appearing to engage in moral equivalence. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, the expulsions were politically constructed as acts of national justice. In Britain and the United States, they were not prominently discussed because the Potsdam Agreement that had authorized them was an Allied achievement and because the populations involved were German, a category that had limited claim on public sympathy in the immediate post-war years. The 12th truth involves the Allied treatment of German prisoners of war held in camps in France and the United States in the period immediately after the German surrender. The conditions in some of these camps, particularly in France, were extremely poor. There is a contested historiographical debate, most prominently associated with the Canadian author James Back, about whether American and Allied policy deliberately allowed large numbers of German prisoners to die through neglect, starvation, and exposure. The scholarly consensus on the higher death toll figures Back proposed is skeptical, and mainstream historians consider his methodology flawed. However, the scholarly consensus does acknowledge that conditions in some camps were genuinely lethal. that mortality rates were higher than they should have been, and that the Geneva Convention protections that Germany was required to apply to Allied prisoners were not consistently applied by Allied forces to German prisoners. The category of disarmed enemy forces, which the United States Army created for German prisoners held after the formal surrender, was specifically designed to remove them from the protections of the Geneva Convention, which applied to prisoners of war, but not to this newly created administrative category. The creation of this category was not accidental. It was a deliberate legal maneuver designed to reduce American obligations under international law toward a population of millions of people who were being held in custody. The conditions that resulted, whatever their precise mortality impact, were the product of a deliberate administrative decision. The 13th truth concerns the role of IBM and other American corporations in facilitating Nazi census and data management operations through the early years of the war. Edwin Black's research documented how IBM's German subsidiary, De Homag, provided and maintained the Hollerith punch card systems that the Nazi government used to conduct the 1933 census and subsequent population registration operations. These systems were used to identify, categorize, and locate Jewish populations in Germany, and as German control expanded across occupied Europe. The technology was sophisticated for its time. The system sorted populations by religion, ethnicity, occupation, and other characteristics that were directly relevant to the Nazi racial classification project. The relationship between IBM and its German subsidiary during the Nazi period is historically established. The more contested question is how much the American parent company knew about how its technology was being used and what obligations, moral or legal, that knowledge created. The historical record includes evidence of ongoing business contact between IBM's American headquarters and its German subsidiary well into the wartime period, through neutral countries after direct contact became legally prohibited. Whatever the precise extent of IBM's knowledge, the technology it provided was functionally integrated into the administrative machinery of persecution. Punch cards did not kill anyone. They identified people who were then killed through other means. The distinction, while real, is also somewhat academic from the perspective of those who were identified. The 14th truth concerns the French milice, the paramilitary organization that served the Vichy government and conducted operations against the French resistance and Jewish populations with a thoroughness that, by some accounts, exceeded what the German occupation forces required of them. The milice was not a German creation imposed on a reluctant French population. It was a French institution staffed by French people who volunteered for service, led by French officers, and operating with the ideological commitment of a movement that had its own reasons, independent of German direction, for the work it was doing. The systematic collaboration of a significant portion of the French government and institutional apparatus with the German occupation was known during the war and was deeply uncomfortable for the post-war French national narrative, which was constructed around the story of the resistance. De Gaulle's famous statement that France had liberated itself captured the moral aspiration of post-war France, but was not an accurate description of the wartime reality. The extent of French collaboration, including the French police's role in organizing the Vel d'Hiv roundup of July 1942, in which over 13,000 Jewish men, women and children were gathered by French police without German involvement and held in the Velodrome d'Hiver sports stadium under conditions that resulted in deaths from dehydration, heat and suicide before deportation to Auschwitz, was not formally acknowledged by a French head of government until Jacques Chirac did so in 1995, more than 50 years after the event. The records of French collaboration were sensitive enough that access to wartime archives was restricted in France for decades. The Vichy records that have been opened have confirmed the picture of collaboration that the French national narrative had historically minimized. French bureaucrats processed the paperwork. French police made the arrests. French train lines transported the deportees. The German supervision that existed did not need to be particularly aggressive because the French administrative apparatus was capable of managing its own operations. The 15th truth concerns the British naval blockade of Germany and the role that blockade played in German civilian mortality during the First World War, and how that history shaped German military strategy and ideology in the Second World War in ways that are rarely foregrounded in English-language historical accounts. The British blockade of Germany during the First World War is estimated to have caused somewhere between 300,000 and 700,000 civilian deaths from malnutrition and disease. This blockade, which continued after the armistice in November 1918 until the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919, was experienced by the German population as a deliberate act of mass murder by civilian starvation. The German military's development of unrestricted submarine warfare, its planning for rapid military victory to avoid the food security vulnerabilities that blockade created, and the ideological framework in which the German leadership understood the Second World War as partly a war for agricultural living space, Lebensraum, that would free Germany from dependence on imported food, cannot be fully understood without this history. The war Hitler fought was, in the framework of German nationalist ideology, partly a response to the war that Britain had fought against German civilians through economic strangulation. This does not justify what Germany did. It contextualizes it in ways that the British narrative of the Second World War has historically preferred to avoid. The 16th truth involves the systematic rape of German women by Soviet troops as they advanced through eastern Germany in the final months of the war. This occurred on a scale that historians now estimate at somewhere between 1 and 2 million victims. It was documented at the time by Soviet political officers who reported the behavior to superiors who generally did not act to prevent it. German women wrote about it in diaries and memoirs that were suppressed or self-censored for decades because the subject was too painful, too politically complicated, and in the East German state, too dangerous to discuss. The Soviet military command knew what was happening. Stalin's response, when it was raised with him, was to express sympathy for soldiers who had traveled thousands of miles and deserved some relaxation. The political commissars, who were theoretically responsible for maintaining discipline among Soviet troops, were unable or unwilling to act effectively. The behavior was not officially sanctioned, but it was also not seriously suppressed, and the conditions of total war, the collapse of German civil administration, the absence of any functioning legal framework in the occupied areas, meant that there was no institutional mechanism capable of enforcing limits, even if the command structure had genuinely wanted to enforce them. This history was largely absent from West German public discourse for decades, and almost entirely absent from East German public discourse because in East Germany, the Soviet Union was the liberation force, the foundational relationship of the state, and crimes committed by Soviet soldiers were not subjects that could be safely examined. The historian Barbara Johr estimated in the 1990s that approximately 100,000 women in Berlin alone had been raped, with roughly 10,000 dying as a result, from suicide or from the consequences of assault. The opening of archives and the gradual easing of the cultural taboo around the subject has produced more extensive documentation, but even now the full scale of what happened is incompletely understood, because so many of the women affected are dead, and so many of those who survived declined to speak. The 17th truth concerns the Nuremberg trials themselves, which established principles of international law and individual accountability that were genuinely important, while also being shaped by political pressures and prosecutorial choices that compromised their claim to neutral justice. The trials excluded examination of Allied conduct that would have met the definitions of the crimes being prosecuted. The strategic bombing campaigns, which deliberately targeted civilian populations, were not examined because the Allies who were prosecuting would have been subject to prosecution under their own indictments. Soviet crimes, including the Katyn massacre, were included in the original indictment as German crimes. When it became clear that this charge was not sustainable and that defense lawyers were in a position to demonstrate Soviet responsibility, the charge was quietly dropped. The exclusion of Allied conduct from Nuremberg was not primarily a matter of hypocrisy in a simple sense. It reflected the reality that the trials were conducted by victor powers who were not prepared to submit their own conduct to the standards they were applying to the defeated. The principles established at Nuremberg were real and mattered. The application of those principles was selective in ways that were apparent to the defense attorneys who raised them and to the German defendants who pointed to them. The judgment that aggressive war was an international crime was applied retroactively to German leaders who had not been operating under a legal system that recognized it as such. The American prosecution argued that natural law principles superseded positive law, an argument that was accepted in the tribunal's judgment and that has remained contested in international legal scholarship ever since. The 18th truth involves the Japanese-American soldiers of the 422nd Regimental Combat Team, who served as one of the most decorated units in American military history, while many of their family members were held in internment camps under conditions that the government that their unit served had determined were necessary for national security. The 422nd fought in Italy and France. They suffered exceptional casualties. They received exceptional recognition. The contradiction embedded in their service, fighting for a democracy that had suspended the rights of their families based on race, was not prominently discussed in official accounts of their service during the war or in the immediate post-war years. Their families remained in the camps. The unit's performance was used rhetorically by some who argued that Japanese Americans had proven their loyalty, as though loyalty were something that needed to be proven to a government that had dispossessed them without cause. The men of the 422nd did not for the most part speak publicly about this contradiction during the war. Some spoke about it later. The contradiction itself remained embedded in the official celebration of their service in ways that, if examined, revealed the fundamental incoherence of the internment's stated justification. The 19th truth concerns the Catholic Church's institutional response to the Holocaust, a subject that has generated decades of controversy and that remains contested among historians, theologians, and survivors. What the documentary record shows, as opposed to what has been argued in various directions by those who have advocated for or against the canonization of Pope Pius XI, is that the Vatican was aware of the systematic murder of Jewish populations in occupied Europe relatively early in the process, and that the public response of the Vatican was calibrated to avoid a direct confrontation with the German government. The reasoning was not purely self-interested. Vatican officials made calculations about the consequences of a direct public condemnation, including potential German reprisals against Catholic populations in occupied territories and against the Vatican itself. Whether those calculations were correct, whether a stronger public statement would have saved lives or produced reprisals that cost lives, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What can be said is that the institutional response was shaped by institutional self-preservation considerations that were weighed against and found to outweigh the imperative of unambiguous public opposition to mass murder. Whatever acts of rescue were conducted by individual priests, nuns, and lay Catholics, and these acts were real and significant, they were conducted without official institutional direction and in many cases in tension with official institutional caution. The Vatican's wartime archives, which were opened for the period up to 1939 several decades ago, were more fully opened for the subsequent period in 2020. The documents that have emerged have not definitively resolved the debate about Pius XIV's conduct, but they have added to the picture of a Vatican that was receiving detailed information about the Holocaust, debating internally how to respond, and consistently choosing responses calibrated for institutional safety rather than for maximum moral clarity. The 20th truth involves the use of colonial troops by European powers, particularly Britain and France, during the Second World War, and the relationship between that service and the colonial systems that those powers maintained throughout and after the war. Britain mobilized enormous numbers of troops from India, Africa, the Caribbean, and other colonial territories. France mobilized troops from West Africa, North Africa, Madagascar, and Indochina. These troops fought, suffered casualties, and died in service of European imperial powers in a war that was framed as a war for freedom and democracy. The Indian soldiers who fought for Britain in Burma, the tirailleurs Senegalais who fought for France in Italy and France, the soldiers from the Gold Coast, Nigeria, Kenya, and other African territories who served in the East African Campaign. These men were fighting in the service of systems that denied them the political rights the war was ostensibly being fought to protect. The Atlantic Charter, which Roosevelt and Churchill signed in 1941 and which affirmed the right of peoples to choose their own forms of government, was explicitly interpreted by Churchill as not applying to British imperial possessions. The freedom that was being defended in Europe was not being extended to the people who were helping to defend it. The post-war independence movements in India, Indochina, Algeria, and across Africa drew on the experience of colonial soldiers who had fought in the war and who returned home radicalized by the contradiction between what they had been told they were fighting for and the political reality that awaited them. In some cases, the repression of post-war independence movements was conducted by the same military structures that had used colonial troops during the war. French forces that had fought in the resistance were deployed to suppress the Madagascan uprising of 1947, in which somewhere between 11,000 and 100,000 Malagasy people died, depending on the source, in the course of France reasserting colonial control. The transition from the language of liberation to the language of pacification required no fundamental institutional change. The same army, the same administrative apparatus, a different target. The 21st truth concerns the fate of the liberated concentration camp survivors in the months and years after liberation, a period that receives far less attention than the liberation itself. The liberation of camps like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and others in the spring of 1945 was documented extensively and produced some of the most famous photographs and film footage of the war. What was less prominently documented was what happened to the survivors in the period that followed. Many remained in displaced persons camps for years. The displaced persons camps operated under military administration that was, in the early period, often inadequate, sometimes arbitrary, and occasionally hostile. A report commissioned by President Truman in August 1945, conducted by Earl Harrison, who was the American representative to the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, concluded that, with some exceptions, the conditions under which displaced persons were living in American-administered camps were not significantly better than what they had experienced under the Nazis, and in some cases were worse because at least under the Nazis they had expected to be treated as enemies, whereas under American administration they were supposedly being protected as victims. Harrison's report was sharp and specific. It recommended immediate improvements. Some improvements followed. The camps continued for years. The movement of Holocaust survivors to Palestine, which was occurring in the post-war period through both legal and illegal channels, was complicated by British policy restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine under the terms of the 1939 White Paper, which had been issued partly in response to Arab political pressure. Holocaust survivors attempting to reach Palestine by sea were intercepted by the British Navy. The passengers of the Exodus 1947, a ship carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors attempting to reach Palestine, were forcibly returned to Germany by the British government, where they were interned in camps in Hamburg. The images of Holocaust survivors being forced off a ship and into camps on German soil less than 2 years after liberation produced enormous controversy and contributed to the political pressure that led to the United Nations vote on the partition of Palestine in November 1947. The 22nd truth is perhaps the most general and in some ways the most important, and it involves the degree to which the systems, institutions, and operational frameworks that made the worst aspects of the Second World War possible were not dismantled after the war ended, but were adapted, transferred, and continued in new configurations. The scientists who worked on the V-2 rocket program, which used slave labor from concentration camps at Mittelbau-Dora, where thousands of prisoners died in brutal conditions, were recruited by both the United States and the Soviet Union, and formed the core of both nations' space programs and ballistic missile development programs. The American Operation Paperclip, brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States. Many of them had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had direct knowledge of and involvement in the use of slave labor. The intelligence agencies that the Allies established or reformed in the post-war period recruited former intelligence officers from Nazi Germany, not despite their experience, but because of it. Reinhard Gehlen, who had been the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, was recruited by American intelligence and eventually became the head of West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service. His organization was staffed significantly by former SS and Wehrmacht intelligence personnel. The files they brought with them, the operational methods they had developed, the networks they had built across Eastern Europe, these were treated as assets rather than as evidence. The British interrogation program for German POWs at the London Cage and other facilities involved methods that violated the laws of war and that were documented in complaints from prisoners and from British military personnel who witnessed them. The files on the London Cage were classified for decades. When they were finally opened, they revealed a systematic program that used solitary confinement, starvation, sleep deprivation, and physical abuse as standard interrogation tools. The men who ran the program were never prosecuted. Many went on to careers in British government and intelligence. The lawyers who constructed the legal frameworks that justified internment without trial, targeting of civilians, suspension of treaty obligations, and intelligence cooperation with former enemies, they did not disappear after the war. They returned to their professions. They wrote their memoirs. Some wrote academic papers on the law of war. The legal reasoning they had developed in service of wartime necessity became part of the body of legal thought that subsequent generations of lawyers inherited and drew upon. The operational logic of the Second World War, the understanding that mass civilian casualties could be justified by military necessity, that legal categories could be constructed and discarded by governments to serve immediate purposes, that populations could be classified and managed through administrative means, that the productivity of extermination could be measured and optimized like any other industrial process. This logic did not end with the signing of surrender documents on the deck of a battleship in Tokyo Bay, or in a railway carriage in a French forest. The records that were sealed after the war were not sealed forever. Many have been opened gradually over the decades that followed. The opening of the archives has not produced a clean reckoning. It has produced a more complicated picture of an event that was already complicated. A war in which the systems that committed the worst atrocities were not aberrations from normal institutional function, but extensions of it. A war in which the distinction between perpetrator and bystander and collaborator was less clear in practice than it has been in memory. A war in which the administrative apparatus of civilization was turned with bureaucratic efficiency toward the destruction of millions of people, and in which the apparatus itself survived the war intact, its files reorganized, its personnel redistributed, its logic available for future application. The war ended. The systems that had run it filed their final reports, archived their records, and continued.